Modern control does not arrive with the clash of weapons. It arrives quietly, as a rigid architecture settling over the mind. We are traversing the age of governmental control. This geopolitical epoch is defined by a radical re-engineering of the socio-epistemological contract, specifically the strict redrawing of the boundaries of permissible knowledge. Historically, social stability rested on a foundation of shared inquiry. Truth was a discovered property, a bottom-up collective pursuit driven by empirical observation and debate. This model represents our historical baseline, individual nodes engaging in a dynamic, horizontal exchange of data, flowing freely from the ground up. That horizontal communication is now severed. We are moving into mandated certainty, where the state enforces a strict, unidirectional flow of state-issued data. The state asserts a monopolistic claim as the final arbiter of reality. It bypasses collective deliberation entirely to become an epistemic autocrat, holding the exclusive power to define what constitutes a fact. This creates profound cognitive dissonance. Citizens are raised on legacy democratic values that champion critical thinking, only to collide with a state-sponsored paternalism that views those exact critical faculties as a liability. To execute this level of control, physical coercion is inefficient. Instead, the state relies on targeted linguistic interventions. The explicit objective of these interventions is to lobotomize the individual's capacity for independent sensory and empirical observation. If you cannot process your own sensory data, you cannot challenge the official reality. This marks the structural termination of the mind's right to perceive. To understand how this architecture is maintained, we have to examine exactly how language is weaponized to enforce it. Any state actor seeking to maintain narrative dominance must standardize its terminology. Labels like disinformation and misinformation are rarely deployed as objective descriptors of accuracy. They operate as tactical weapons of silence. This matrix maps the tactical utility of narrative labels. The disinformation row reveals their primary function, speaker delegitimization. By branding a source subversive, the state avoids evidence and closes debate. A secondary mechanism, the label of untruth, functions as a barrier preempting independent evaluation. These terms are not designed to win arguments. They are engineered to close conversation before public deliberation can ever begin. By disqualifying dissent at its point of origin, the state engineers a compliant, intellectually passive citizenry without ever incurring the administrative cost of defending its own narrative. The systematic deployment of these linguistic weapons is an execution of asymmetric information warfare. In a traditional democracy of ideas, the massive burden of proof weight rests heavily on the state to demonstrate evidence. However, preemptively applying the disinformation label aggressively alters this. The burden is transferred, forcing the citizen to prove they aren't a bad actor. The state employs this shift as a deliberate resource optimization strategy. Eliminating the requirement to prove its own claims drastically reduces the administrative cost of defending official positions in an open forum. Asymmetric information warfare effectively criminalizes the process of inquiry itself. It makes the cost of dissent prohibitively high for any individual truth seeker. The engine driving this narrative management is an underlying ideology known as cognitive paternalism. Cognitive paternalism is birthed from a severe trust deficit between the governing apparatus and the governed populace. The conviction driving this policy is explicit. The state operates on the belief that the public simply cannot be trusted to think for themselves. This illustrates the conflict over intellectual agency. The paternalistic state categorizes the public as incapable, necessitating the state act as the exclusive distributor of reality. In contrast, the sovereignty of thought asserts the individual's inherent moral responsibility to evaluate evidence independently. Under paternalism, the unmanaged mind is pathologized. The individual's internal processing mechanisms are classified as a source of disorder and a latent security risk to state power. To ensure social stasis, the state shields its subjects from conflicting data. It explicitly prioritizes administrative efficiency over human intellectual agency. Total narrative control necessitates the intentional sacrifice of individual sovereignty. When the state mandates truth, it systematically alters both the architecture of public life and the nature of the citizenry. We map this architecture through 4 consequences. First, termination of intellectual freedom replaces open thought with permissible ideas. Second, usurpation of public inquiry replaces truth-seeking with state certainty. Third, citizens transition into managed subjects. Finally, preemption of empirical scrutiny permanently insulates state power from debate. This architecture insulates state power from the accountability of evidence. By eliminating the administrative cost of managing dissent, it creates a vacuum where state certainty remains unchallenged by independent judgment. But architectures of control are vulnerable to the friction of empirical reality. The defining conflict is the tension between state-mandated reality and the sovereign mind. Navigating this environment requires adopting a protocol for epistemic survival, a rigorous counterframework designed to reclaim intellectual agency. This animated model demonstrates the first pillar of the protocol, constant intellectual vigilance. We must actively interrogate the labels used to silence public debate. Terms like disinformation must be audited and stripped from datasets so the underlying evidence can be evaluated on its own merits rather than accepted as objective truth. The second pillar is to reclaim the right of judgment. This requires a calculated refusal to outsource judgment to centralized authorities. You must maintain decentralized frameworks for independent evidence mapping. The third and final pillar is to assert the sovereignty of conscience. The capability to weigh evidence and reach independent conclusions is an unalienable human right. It is an absolute requirement of existence, not a gift granted by the state. Intellectual agency is the non-negotiable foundation of all liberties. Without the right to seek truth independently, the free citizen is forever extinguished.